There you go. This meeting is being recorded. So, so it will be available on the Becky website under the learning menu. The last choice is online schmoozes, and it should be up within a couple of days. Welcome, everybody. I think I know everybody, but my name is Daryl Cooperstock. I'm the tech host for this evening, and Shoshana Zaks will be your program host for this evening. Our guest is Rachel Forbes, and we're really excited to have her with us. And Shoshana will tell you a little bit more about Rachel and what she's going to be speaking about. Can everybody hear me okay? Mm-hmm. Good. Okay. As I said, tonight's session will be recorded. For everyone's sake, though, while Shoshana's making the introduction and while Rachel is giving her presentation, please keep yourself on mute, everybody, or I will mute you so that we can have as little distraction as possible. Rachel is happy to have people ask questions, make comments, etc. There will be breaks in the presentation where that will be sort of a natural time. If you have a question or comment that come up, please use your chat function to send me the word question or comment, or you can send it to everyone and I'll see it anyway. And I'll make a list of people in the order in which they submit their questions or comments, and that's the order we'll have people called on. Please keep yourself on mute until you're called on, and then remute yourself after you've asked your question. I will usually acknowledge that I've received your request for a question and let you know who you're going after so that you can anticipate when you should be ready to ask your question. Anybody have any questions about format or anything else? Okay, right. It's all yours, Shoshana.
Okay, well, again, welcome everyone. It's really nice to see all of your faces, and I am very excited to we're going to be listening to Rachel tonight for a couple of reasons. One is I was thinking back, I think I met you first, Rachel, when you were in preschool, or maybe even before that. And so, like many of the people on this screen, I have watched you grow up, and to me, it's just a beautiful thing to see somebody turn into a fantastic adult with so many interesting stories to tell. And I know everybody's going to be very excited to hear your talk. I'm going to introduce, just to say that Rachel has obviously grew up in Becky. She graduated from Ezra Academy. She had her bat mitzvah celebrated at Becky. She's now a social worker with a very thriving private practice in New Haven. And when I first saw her name on the sign outside of her office on Orange Street, I stopped my car and jumped out. I was like, what? Because I still thought of you as that preschooler, but there you were running a private practice in New Haven. So go figure. Tonight, we're so excited because Rachel's going to talk about a number of things, some starting with her own personal experiences. Rachel was born in Korea and adopted by her parents, who are here, Rob and Joanne, in New Haven. And so she was raised Jewish in the United States. And so she and I talked about this the other night. There are different ways to describe that kind of adoption. One is to call it a transcultural adoption. One is to call it a transracial adoption, et cetera. But it means people growing up in a family who don't come from the same background necessarily genetically. So she's going to talk a little bit about her personal experience. And then, because there's been so much in the news lately about anti-Asian racism, which, as we all probably know, is nothing new, even though suddenly it's getting a lot of airplay for a bunch of reasons. But it's a time, that we can start, I guess it's time to talk about it more openly and think about ways that we can help heal some of the racism in our country, or, ideas that we all have to make things better for all people who are non-Caucasian, non-white in our country. So without any further ado, I'm going to introduce Rachel and start by asking you to discuss a little bit about your childhood and what it was like growing up in your family.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that introduction. And I can recognize a number of faces here. It's so good to see you. And there's a part of me that's like, oh my goodness, there are many of you who have seen me grow up and have walked through some, perhaps with my parents, some of the challenges that I did face as being an adoptee, for which thank you for being there to support my parents. um, and so firstly, I'm sure most of you, if not all of you who know my parents, they are the most kind, critically thoughtful, open-minded, and loving parents I could have ever asked for. And I think that I was always welcomed into their family just as their own, which I think is also largely kind of the narrative and expectation within adoption, is that you're adopting this child and you're going to raise this child as your own, right? Meaning I'm going to raise my child within my culture and within my community. And I think that, um, you know, going to Ezra and growing up within predominantly like a Jewish community and predominantly a white community, um, I've always felt and identified as Jewish. And it was never sort of like a question, largely because it was part of my daily life, right? So I would go to Ezra, half of my curriculum would be Judaics and Hebrew, and then, secular education. And it was just sort of like the norm for me. But what I did find is that comments would be made among my friends that are sort of like, why are your eyes like that? Why is your nose like that? Oh, and there would be these sort of like analogies to me being like Lucy Liu, right? Or I was always associated with any kind of Asian stereotype. And the intention was never malicious in any way, but it certainly made me feel pretty othered. Like I never considered pointing out aesthetics of anybody else around me, but my aesthetics were always pointed out to me. And so I was self-conscious about how I looked, and I wanted to look more Caucasian. My best friend was blonde hair, blue eyed, and, she was sort of like that stereotypical standard of beauty. And I just would look at myself and be like, disgusted, right? But there was no malicious intent, but it was more of just sort of like my appearance was different. And the jokes that were made were not, again, they weren't intentionally mean, but sort of like, these jokes of like, oh, do you do nails, right? Or you must love sushi, or you must love, X, Y, or Z. And those kinds of microaggressions were really hurtful. And I think that it was one of those things that perhaps flew under the radar, largely because I didn't have the language to name what that felt like. I also don't think that my parents perhaps had the tools to ask about it either. And I also think that, I've always been a very social person. And I think that because I was always, seemingly happy and engaged with all of my friends, that I was doing well. It didn't occur probably to my parents, especially at Ezra or in middle school, that maybe this was something that was painful. And so one of the things that I've kind of talked about with my parents in retrospect, and now in working with other transracial and transcultural adoptees, is I wish that there had been some sort of daily incorporation of Korean culture in my life. And that isn't to say so my parents did make an effort in a lot of ways. So firstly, let me back up a little bit. My parents have always been open and honest and transparent about my adoption. They have always, been willing and able to tell my story, my birth story. They've always been willing and able to, allow me to ask any questions. They bought me a hanbok, which is traditional Korean garb, when I was, 1, and they would take me to these Korean picnics that were hosted at Yale through Casey. Where I was, connected with an older brother or an older sister, and I would, watch this traditional Korean dance. I would eat traditional Korean food. I would do, sort of like calligraphy even. But because these moments in time were so isolated and separate from my daily life, I would go to these spaces and be like, what is this? And I would leave those spaces, not really carrying any of that with me. And so I think, also at Ezra, there really wasn't a lot of information or education about Asian history, about Asian American history. And so my aesthetic identity and my cultural roots were just not a part of my life. And now after having my daughter, who is now almost 5 years old, I've given a lot more thought and mindfulness to how I want to incorporate her Koreanhood. And I'm actually finding myself having to reconnect with my own Koreanhood through all of that. But that, I think, is something that I would certainly say I wished that I had had. And it's also not something that I blame my parents for, because I also don't think that there was any of that kind of conversation or education from the adoption agencies necessarily. And I think that it's something that I'm hoping will shift within the adoption community, specifically the transracial and transcultural adoption community, where this is sort of an ongoing conversation and engagement with parents, adoptive parents. Because what we find later on, of course, as adults, is that some way or another, it catches up, right? And the questions are consistently asked, like within the Jewish community. And I say, I'm Jewish. And I immediately know and expect the shock, oh, so cool. But also I can, there's curiosity, understandably so. And I have compassion for that, while I also, for me, it doesn't feel so far-fetched because it's been my everyday experience since I was, 3 months old. And so I think that the foreignness that a lot of people will react with, for me, feels foreign because it's just not my experience. And sometimes it makes me feel othered in a way that hurts my feelings, even though the intention is not hurtful. And I find myself having to kind of explain that, which sometimes gets annoying because I feel jealous of people who don't have to explain that, if you will. Even though it's a beautiful thing to have a unique story, and it's a beautiful thing to be curious about each other and about, different experiences, but sometimes it feels kind of othering when internally I don't feel other. So I think that has been challenging in a lot of ways, but I'm also really grateful for my parents' openness and willingness to always allow me to explore this, to feel upset about this, to, be my rebellious teenage self through this. I was probably more difficult than most teenagers. I will say that. So thank you, Mom and Dad, for your patience through all of that. I know my karma is coming. And so, it's one of the things my mom said that I really appreciate is that it's an ongoing journey, I think, both for my parents and for myself, in that we're continuously learning. But I think the most important and powerful piece is our willingness to continue to learn, right? So there's still an open-mindedness and a willingness to say, oh, yeah, maybe I kind of missed the mark there. And I wonder what are the ways that I can, do better the next time. And I think, both of us, myself and my parents, we've really supported each other, I think, in that way. So.
Yeah. Can you speak at all about, well, I know you can, because we've had a little bit of a conversation, but talk about, because you are in a situation where you can be seen as other in a bunch of different settings, right? So if you're with other Koreans or other Asians, and then you talk about being Jewish, is that, that's got to also be a little bit of cognitive dissonance, and how that plays out and what that's been like for you.
Definitely. I think what I've also found is that my Americanness is very obvious to Koreans, and my clearly not being Korean is very obvious to Koreans. So it feels like there's less explaining that I need to do there. But I think I mean, one thing I will say is that my husband, so his family is connected to the Orthodox community, to the Chabad community. And I have faced quite a few challenges in that community, I will say. I have been told by some people that you will never be seen as Jewish, as authentically Jewish. And I've actually had a rabbi before my wedding come to me and say, nobody in the community is going to marry you because we don't see you as Jewish. And that was like really hurtful, but I also could acknowledge and recognize that this was their belief system. And like, I can't change that. I also just said I respectfully disagree, but we can agree to disagree on that. And I think too that I've gotten a lot of shock, perhaps a more overt shock within the Orthodox community when I say I'm Jewish. I also happen to have a Hebrew tattoo. And so people will be like, whoa, what's that? Why do you have that? And then I'll be able to like respond to when I hear people speaking Hebrew to each other. I'll be able to be like, oh yeah, you know, and they're totally shocked, which I find a lot of like joy in that. But, but
Rachel, we actually have a comment
oh, sure.
from the Food and Forbes home.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Unmute, guys.
Unmute, please, Joanne.
Thank you, Rob. Yeah. Thank you, Rachel, especially for the kind comments. You know, I think that one of the challenges, and I've said this before, was we always accepted you. We accepted Rachel completely as ours and didn't really see any difference. And that was kind of reinforced by the fact that when we joined Becky and Rachel started Ezra, there felt like complete acceptance. In fact, I didn't get any comments whatsoever from any people in either community questioning. I mean, the issue of being Jewish was not brought up in any way. So, you know, it was very easy to not see the other part because it, you know, it just didn't come up. And yeah, in retrospect, should have pushed it more, but it's sort of the push-pull of, do you identify and push the, oh, you're different versus, oh, you are ours. So that's it. And I also wanted to make this comment about the people in the Orthodox community. I heard that actually from Rob. I was furious because halachically it makes no sense. Rachel was converted by Orthodox Bet Din. So who are they to say that it's not valid? So
Yeah. I mean, I'm in complete agreement with that. And I think, you know, sometimes there's only so much you can say or do, you know. And I think that, Mom, when you were talking about, you know, being ours and naming difference, what I think so often can feel scary for adoptive parents is associating the naming difference with then separating, right? Or with distancing from the child. When in fact, naming the difference can still be inclusive as something that's, sorry, there's a bird behind me and I realized I didn't close that door. That naming that difference as totally normal and okay, I think is also really inclusive and really, I mean, it doesn't shift or change my being yours, for example. I'm going to speak in the context of you and me, is that, you know, me being yours and me being different and Korean, they, you know, they don't exclude each other. And so I think that one of the things that I'm hoping, I'm actually going to be doing a training for therapists who are working with transracial adoptees. And one of the things that both myself and the co-host have been talking about is, you know, normalizing the difference, and that that's something that actually is really loving rather than distancing, because it's allowing the child to really explore and acknowledge their, cultural roots, their roots and identity, the many facets of their identity that they're going to be faced with in the public, whether we like it or not, right? Because questions are consistently asked. And so giving the child, the language and the normalization of talking about, their race, their, culture of origin, I think is actually really empowering and really loving. And it's really just saying that, like, isn't difference such a beautiful thing, right? That diversity is in fact a beautiful thing rather than it's almost as if, like, by tiptoeing around it, you're like perpetuating the otherness, right? It's saying, ooh, can't touch that because I'm afraid, but the child will pick up on that, right? And then it feels like, ooh, maybe I can't touch that either, even though it's a part of the child's identity. Yeah, and I don't think that you did that in any way, Mom and Dad. I just think that that's what often gets, like, misconstrued, and then, it has consequence down the line. Yeah.
So now you have a daughter, and she has one parent who looks Asian, like as she does, because I've met Bailey, and she has one parent who looks totally different,
Mhm.
and very Caucasian and blonde, if I can recall
That
correctly.
blonde, blue-eyed.
Yeah, like the whole bit. So how does that conversation go in your house about how three people can be a family and not all be the same, and how do you handle that?
Can
Yeah,
I interrupt for just a second, Rachel?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
yeah, of course.
Rabbi Woodward actually
Oh.
had a question comment, and I was on mute, and so
Okay.
I failed to be able to effectively interrupt you.
Sorry.
So go ahead, Eric. Why don't you unmute yourself?
Oh, but you're fine. Yeah, sure, Sean. It's I wanted to hear the direction you're, but I'll go ahead. But Rachel, I just want to thank you. Like, this is really beautiful and compelling, and I really appreciate the like deep sense of like honesty, like that personal sense of like how you experience the world. And I also say I really relate to what you're saying personally. In my own family, like my father's not Jewish and he comes from a Mexican background, and for me, something that's different is that I'm like white presenting. He's less so. But as I've encountered, like, I really related to what you just said about no, like, there's sort of one stage of the sort of embrace and saying everything is simple, but there's a need to also pull back and say, oh, but it's not, and I'm also this. And when I was sort of first getting connected to Jewish stuff around college age and stuff like that, a lot of the message from the Jewish community was saying, oh, you've got this complexity in your background, but your mother's Jewish, so you're 100% Jewish, no complexity whatsoever, don't worry. And as I matured and went through it, no, there's plenty of complexity. And I want to, as I've had kids, finding language for their Mexican heritage has been so important to me, and thinking about that. And I just want to thank you for lifting that up, because I just think that is such an important part of like not just this sort of like the transracial experience of like adoption or of identity, but also so much of like the human dynamic that we go through, where there are things that we sometimes hold on to, and there are ways where we're different. So anyway, just really appreciate what you've been saying.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And I appreciate your camaraderie and validation of that. I think too, like, even when you said, when people will say, don't worry. Oh, well, I wasn't worried until now. Now you made me think I have
Yep. Perfect. Yep.
Where, like, it wasn't even a concern for me to not be included until you then named that as a potential, which then just sort of informs you about how other people are perceiving you. And that doesn't feel so good, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't always feel so good, even though the intention is loving. What's happening, though, is this kind of compartmentalizing that I feel like can be harmful. And I think that the diversity and the complexity, I love that you name that too, because the more we talk about it, the more we're also giving our children the tools to know what to say or how to feel when they are faced with these kinds of things.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
That's so beautiful. So right on.
Yeah.
Shoshana, I don't want to interrupt
okay.
your question, but I do have a couple of.
That's fine. I'd rather have other
Okay.
people's questions than.
Okay. Donna, why don't you go ahead with your question?
Okay, thank you. Rachel, great to see you, and your talk is beautiful, and so are you. Well, I always thought so. Even when you were a preschooler. But my question is, when you talk about how you wish your parents could have incorporated more aspects of that otherness and that cultural heritage, I get that, I guess, but my question is, how do other people do it? Because on the other hand, when other people, it seemed, pointed out differences, maybe in not such a nice way, it didn't feel good. So how, I often find myself talking to someone of another race, and, you know, do you acknowledge it? Do you ask questions about it, or do you ignore it, and that sort of thing? So what's your advice for the rest of us who don't have maybe transcultural adoptees, but have transcultural experiences?
Yeah, I think one of the things I feel like I have honed in on this year, and I've learned largely actually because of BLM, is how this kind of starts young, right? So this means immersing yourself in, just if possible, which I understand it's not always possible, there needs to be an effort made, but you know, immersing yourself in communities that are diverse, where your child is, for example, exposed to that a little bit more regularly, right? And incorporating books. I also think that it's the responsibility of schools, for example, to you know, have curriculums that are multi-ethnic, right? Multicultural, and offer perspectives of history that are not just from, you know, Europe or from the United States, that I think I could have really benefited from, for example, at Ezra. I think that it's just sort of like the normalization of diversity that I think we are responsible for, you know, seeking and exposing ourselves to, self-educating, right? Where when we're meeting somebody who is different, it's not sort of like this touchy thing, largely because it's touchy because we've lacked exposure and it feels foreign and a little bit scary. I think also now, because the political climate is really charged, that I think a lot of people are a little bit nervous about knowing what the right thing to do is, right? But I think it is, you know, talking to another human being like a human being. And when there is curiosity and questions, you can ask them, but I think also be prepared for potential discomfort around that. And if you notice that the person is uncomfortable, maybe inquire about that, or, you know, acknowledge and take a moment to sort of say, I wonder why that might have been offensive or hurtful. I think there's like consistent opportunity for learning when we have these kinds of interactions, because also, you know, people are coming from different experiences and also different internal places in terms of how they feel in their own identity, how confident they feel, and are willing and able to have some of these honest conversations where there's authentic curiosity. So I think I would say it's okay to be curious. I also think that maybe be prepared for people who are not willing and able or ready to engage in responding to that, right? And to be mindful about how might that be harmful, if in any way, right? Like, am I responsible for having like done the research myself, right? Or am I responsible for, you know, I don't know. I'm losing my my train of thought, but I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I mean, in my work, my job is partly asking people a lot of invasive questions. And when it comes, you know, I tend to go and ask everything, you know, and I always wondered if I'm sort of going overboard when I'm, you know, when did you decide you were gay, or where did you, you know, what, isn't it amazing that you're a teacher when you're black and you're 90 years old? How did you do that? I mean, I'll ask those things, and I never know whether I'm really being offensive.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
And I
just the
think
people.
Yeah, I think that that can vary, right? I think one of the best leading things is curiosity, but I think also it's with some mindfulness that you don't know where the other person is. I mean, our bodies can typically pick up on where the person is once they start to respond. Um, but to be prepared for maybe having to do some of your own work, right? If you notice that maybe something I said was a little bit hurtful or received in a way that could have been hurtful, and get curious with yourself about maybe what could I have done differently, in what kind of way was that hurtful. I think all of the questions are important.
Thank you. Nancy, you had a comment?
Yes, Rachel, I want to say that you're doing great. I relate to a lot of what you're talking about because my older daughter is from Guatemala
Mm-hmm.
through similar situations. And I will say that her situation got a lot better when she met her birth family.
Wow.
I researched this and we went there several times. Molly goes there. Well, she hasn't been there during COVID, but she was visiting her there twice a year after they met.
Mm-hmm.
Molly's college graduation, I brought her there, and also to her law school graduation and her wedding.
Wow. Wow.
And it made an incredible difference. But I think that if you can encourage people to meet their birth families, it really helps a lot.
I'm in complete agreement with you. One of the things that I will almost always say to, for example, adoptees that I'm working with is, you have two families, right?
Right.
And that is a truth in your story, and it's also not something that's bad, which I think.
I'm very happy about it. And I don't any less Molly's mother because of her birth.
Yeah, it's so true. And, Nancy, I really appreciate, as an adoptee, and I can say this too for my parents, I really appreciate your willingness and openness to allow your daughter to explore that. Because I think that oftentimes it is really challenging for adoptive parents to accept that, there was a family, there is another family that the child really comes from.
Other family out there for most adoptees who's hurting
Mm-hmm.
that child. And I did the research myself to find the birth mother. And then I talked to Molly about it.
Yeah.
And it's been wonderful.
It's so beautiful. And what a beautiful thing that she's been able to have like this loving relationship with her birth family, which isn't always the case, right? I think that
You never know what you're going to find, but in her case, she found a really lovely family.
it's really amazing, really amazing.
And I think going forward, there's going to be fewer of these adoptions because so many of the countries are closed.
Yeah, yeah.
Are you involved in Adoptive Parents Committee at all? There's a chapter in Connecticut.
I am not.
Because I'd love to hear from you, I'm sure.
Oh, well, I'd be happy to participate, to talk to anybody. I've been working largely with like the Adoption Assistance Program and the Connecticut Council on Adoption.
Right.
Yeah.
Parents Committee of parents who, some of them are looking to adopt, some of them have already adopted,
Mhm.
and monthly meetings, and they have speakers that come in. I know the person who's president. I'm going to talk to him. I'm not involved anymore, but I was when my children were young.
Sure, sure. And I'm grateful to hear too that there is an organization that supports adoptive parents, because I think there's such a high need for that.
They're really.
Yeah, yeah, that's wonderful.
I met you at the synagogue, and I met your little girl. She's beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
And your
Thank you. Oh, sorry. Go
Sorry
ahead.
about that, Nancy.
Thank you. Your parents have done a great job.
They're pretty amazing. I will say,
Yeah.
like, super, super grateful.
You were very lucky to get them.
I totally agree. I totally agree.
Thank you. We actually have a line of people waiting to make comments and questions. So I thank you, Nancy, for that. That was terrific. Helene.
So I have another Molly. The new mom is Molly, and she's from the Dominican Republic. And through the adoption agency, we met and became lifelong friends with two other families. And when the kids were 11, we made the decision that we would go on a trip to the DR. And we decided on 11 because they were old enough to know the importance and relevance of this trip to their lives, and they were young enough that they wouldn't hate us yet. So we had it covered. And that was really very exciting and important for each of the kids. And now, and we've always celebrated Adoption Day every year and had a lot of activities around that. But recently, Molly has done Ancestry and 23andMe and discovered a cousin who ended up living in her house, in her apartment, which is totally out of
building.
in the building, which is totally crazy. I mean, of all the people in the world, that this young woman ended up getting an apartment in her building. And the first thing she said to me was, "Mom, I never knew anyone who had my blood before. She looks like me. Her hair color is like me. Her hair texture is like mine." And it's really very thrilling and wonderful to incorporate these new families. And, you know, I feel like our family has expanded and she's really enjoying it. And when we met the new baby, the baby was wearing a onesie that said, "My abuela loves me." And that's my name. So it works for me. You know, I went through Bubby and that didn't work. And I went through Safta and that wasn't there. And I just said, well, you know, she'll choose a name for me. But when I saw that shirt, I cried and I said, that's me. Okay. And it's been wonderful.
So beautiful. And I love Molly. I grew up with Molly, and she has, I mean, it has been so moving for me to sort of to hear from Molly in this journey that she's had in reconnecting with her birth family. Really incredible.
Thank you. And thank you, Helene. Lyndon has a question, a comment. Lyndon, can you unmute?
I can do that.
Thank you.
So I guess I'm the third parent of adoptive kids in this age range. Ours was always an open adoption because my younger three came home at almost 7, 8, and 9, and there was no way I was going to expect them to walk away from family of origin. It just did not seem fair or reasonable. And fortunately, most of the time that worked, to the point that extended family came for B'nai Mitzvot or Benot Mitzvot, and were around for things like graduations and that kind of thing. So it's not always easy, but it's incredibly important. And if anyone here is thinking about adoption or is in the process and doesn't have an open adoption, do your kids a favor and figure it out, because the only way to raise whole human beings is to wholly embrace who they are.
Thank you, Lyndon.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that, you know, it is challenging for a lot of adoptive parents, and it's also an important conversation to have. And I think that one of the things that I think is important to name, of course, I use a phrase called the adoption triad. So that's the birth family, the adoptive family, and the adoptee. And one of the things that we kind of name is that there's a loss in each realm, and that, you know, there's complications and layers to each part of the triad that I think deserve to be honored. And so it's also hearing and understanding why that might be challenging for an adoptive family or an adoptive parent to consider that, right? For a lot of people, that's really scary. And it's also, you know, it's also really important, though, for the adoptee to have permission to explore that, right? Not all adoptees want to reconnect with their birth families, which is also okay. But I think what's important is the permission for the adoptee to consider that, to explore that, to sort of walk through that, in their own time and way.
Thank you. David, you had a question. Can you unmute, please?
John, there we go. Thank you. Rachel, as you've gotten to know more about Korean culture, Korean perspective, have you found any particular areas that between all that you learned and know of your Jewish heritage and what you've learned about your Korean heritage, either are particularly simpatico or are particularly tension-filled, that you might want to give us insight into?
That's a really good question. So I am largely this last year, I've really been diving more into reconnecting with my Korean culture. So I'm new. But what I will say, from what I do understand, is that I think this feels shared, is that family and community is really important in both cultures. And I think that this sort of kind of like honoring the ancestry is shared. And I think too, what feels different, at least, and you know what, maybe this is also my experience with Judaism, which I'm now learning is different from other people's experience with Judaism, particularly being connected to the Orthodox community, is that, and this is also something that I feel like I learned at Ezra, is kind of like this critical thought and the encouraging of asking like really hard questions that maybe challenge the status quo, right? Or that are, which sometimes in Korean culture that can be received as being disrespectful, which I think I appreciate a lot, in the ways that I've had experiences with, like, for example, like studying the Talmud at Ezra. I appreciate, debate, and I appreciate, I think that for me, at least, that's from what I know now, which may be limited and may not be the full picture and, true understanding. But those are some things that I feel like I've picked up on, at least, that feel similar, but also different.
Thank you. Thank you, David and Rachel. We have a comment from John Weiser.
Hi, Rachel. I want to thank you for your wonderful insights, and I also just how clear and how loving you are in being able to talk about really difficult things in a way that feels very embracing. I'm really impressed. So I have a comment, a confession, and a question. So the comment is, what you've really highlighted for me is an adoptive parent who brings in a child from another culture or race, particularly one who is visibly different. So that child is embraced and they're wonderful. And then the child starts encountering the world and they discover that lots of people in the world have attitudes, expectations, biases, just because of how they look. And they're trying to sort of figure, how do I deal with that? So the confession is, I spend most of my life working with low-income communities, particularly African-American. And what I learned, actually quite painfully, was that it was at some level, I didn't really understand the lived experience of the people in the community. And it would come out by my saying things that I thought were neutral, that they found very offensive. Kind of like you must like sushi quote. It's sort of like, I thought it was a neutral thing and they found. And so what I've learned in my practice is, if I'm going to do work in those communities, I have to have someone on my team who has that lived experience, because they can help me to understand, they can help build bridges. But so the question then becomes for parents. So like if my son were to adopt a transracial, what would be the equivalent for him? I can find someone who sits on my team and helps me to understand the lived experience because I don't have it. What's sort of the equivalent for parents? How do they understand the lived experience because they don't have it?
Right, right. And I think that so at the baseline, one of my favorite things that I've heard actually from my therapist was, if you don't know, you just don't know, right? So also granting yourself a little bit of grace in that, and forgiveness for that, right? In that it's okay to not know, but then it is then your responsibility to know. And
Right.
once you know, you can't not know, right? So I think largely I think even if you don't have somebody on your team, I think it's connecting to the community, right? Finding people to be on your team. And also really doing the work to understand the culture of origin. And
Right.
that can be in books, that can be in documentaries, that can be in
Right.
films, that can be in music, that can be in like courses, right? That can also be talking to a therapist who is also of that culture of origin, right? And
Yes.
perhaps hopefully somebody who is experienced in adoption.
Right.
I know that, for example, right now I have most of my clients who are reaching out, or prospective clients who are reaching out to me, are Asian identifying, or Asian transracial adoptees. And so there's also this, seeking people who will understand, right? And you know what, as parents who do not live that experience, I think it's okay to name, I actually can't know what you experience and how you walk through this world. And I want you to know that I'm here for you and I love you. And tell me more. What is it like for you? How can I be here for you? What do you need from me to feel loved and supported? Right. And I think a lot of that too is connecting to communities where you have kids who look like your kid. So
Right.
living in communities where you have a lot of children who look like your children.
Right.
And incorporating the books, the children books, right? The movies, the shows,
Right.
which actually I'm impressed with. Disney's shifting. I'm impressed with, there's more also on PBS, inclusive media, which I didn't have growing up, and I really wish that I had. And so I'm also, like, for example, now with my daughter, I'm engaging in some of these conversations, right? And we're reading books that encourage her asking those questions, if you will. And it's
Right.
just answering honestly,
Yes.
right? Yeah. So
Well, thank you so much. I love your answer. It's wonderful. And I'm just really proud and happy with what you're doing.
oh, thank you so much. Thank you.
Rachel, your mother has a question. It's your turn, Joanne.
Well, first a comment on what Dan said. It is complex. What Rachel has said and what you advised. I don't think we ever shied away from it, but we didn't really have the skills to really. No, I mean, we didn't have Asian friends. I think we had a couple, but that was about it. We weren't in the Asian community. And it's also funny because on the one hand, we wouldn't have fit in with that community anyway, because we're not Korean. So it is complicated. But the question I have, if you don't mind, you don't have to answer it, but I was wondering, a couple of people have talked about birth parents. If you would willing to talk about your experience of feeling about looking for your birth mother.
Yeah, I have always been curious about my birth mother. And it's interesting that it's like specifically my birth mother, less so my birth father. But I've always been curious. I did do a search when I was like, actually before Bailey was born. And I did hear back from her, and her response was, I'm not ready to reconnect with Rachel. I don't know if I ever will be. It largely was because so I was born out of wedlock. I was born through an affair. My father was married and had children. And so my birth mother now has a family of her own, and I have no idea how much information anybody knows, if anything. And so I imagine it's probably a really difficult decision for her to make. But I did feel this like weird, like, oh, like I actually have no idea who this person is, even though there's this like visceral sense that I do. There's also this like external, like, I actually don't really know you. And I might not care if you, it will, like, to some degree, right? That you're not ready to communicate with me. But that's definitely always, it's always on my mind. And I have my birth mother's name tattooed on my arm, which was, in retrospect, maybe not the smartest choice, but I was like 17 or whatever. But I think that she'll always be part of my story. And what's so interesting and feels a little bit like eerie is that when I heard back from my birth mother, Bailey was conceived. So there was this like interesting full circle thing that happened. And I was actually doing a lot of healing work therapeutically around my relationship with my birth mother. And so it was just sort of like this really incredible thing that happened. Yeah.
Thank you. We have Rachel Bashevkin. I think you had a question or a comment? Rachel, are you out there?
Yep, I have a question just to
Okay.
bring it back to the community level. Rachel, you suggested that parents might say to their child, how can I be here for you? And I'm asking that as an officer of a synagogue. I'm aware that the diversity in the Jewish population in this country is not represented in the Jews, who are in the pews. In other words, the diversity that we have in the American Jewish community is not a population that has chosen to affiliate with synagogues. And so I'm guessing that there are some things we have done wrong as institutions. And so I'm turning to you for some advice. What have we done wrong? What could we do better? How can we bring this wonderful diversity of our American Jewish community, into our institutions?
Well, what do you mean by there's been, I mean, I know less about this, but what do you mean by there's a lacking there? Do you mean that like you're not seeing racial diversity like in the synagogue, or are you saying that you're not seeing racial diversity in more like leadership roles in the synagogue? Like, what do you mean by that?
Not even thinking leadership roles, just membership. The demographers tell us of the substantial population, of Jews who are not Ashkenazi, and yet when synagogues are surveyed, it's not represented there. I would imagine that perhaps people who don't look like your classic Ashkenazic Jew are tired of entering institutions and being questioned about whether they're Jewish.
Probably.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts, suggestions,
Well,
if you care to put on the hat of synagogue consultant or Jewish consultant.
I can try. I mean, I guess I'm wondering, so it is challenging to walk into a space and immediately feel different. And I think that that's also something that you can't exactly change all the time. I don't think there is anything necessarily that can be said and done. I think that collectively, culturally, socially, we have a lot of work to do to just normalize diversity, which I think would in the long term really help those kinds of scenarios. But I'm wondering too, like, how do synagogues, I don't know if this exists, but how do synagogues advertise? Like, how do you typically promote your congregation? I don't know. How do you do that?
Can I say something?
Yeah.
There is a synagogue in the Bay Area, Kahillas Israel, that draws on diversity. And one of my sons has been involved in it. And they talk about how they have Black members, Ethiopian Jews, and how these people have been disenfranchised in most synagogues, and where there is a real effort to make them feel part of the community. But it's really a very unusual synagogue and a very welcoming to all. So I think that's one oasis. But people really have. I mean, I think a synagogue really has to decide that they want to make the effort to encourage people who don't look like them.
Yeah. Well, when you say make an effort, I'm also curious, like, what does that tangibly look like? Is this like on Facebook? Is this on, like, how do
I don't know.
Yeah, because I think that that's what I would say, right? Is that if there is a particular avenue for like advertisement, right, or marketing, that there is an effort, just like you're saying, to name the inclusion and the welcoming. And I don't know, does that make sense?
Yeah, I don't think it's Facebook. I think this is a whole community that is very purposeful in the inclusion of, LGBTQ and people of all kinds.
Yeah.
How they look, whatever.
But I guess my question is, like, how does that get spread within a community? Is it through word of mouth? Is it, I actually don't know.
And fundraisers and having people come and speak and do concerts.
I
know because I participated in one of those.
Yeah.
That's what I was going to say. Programming that would be of interest to the broader audience, or, and word of mouth. I mean, Becky is considered to be a pretty welcoming,
yes,
and diverse to a certain extent community, but it's because we've built that over the years and people now know it. I mean, we could certainly expand our diversity, but some of it comes through a bunch of different methods, but it has to be authentic and it has to really flow from who the congregation is and what you're interested in. You can't, you can't just go and say, oh, we want more diverse members. So
right.
It has to be who we are and how we're welcoming people in authentically.
Right. It's sort of like now is Pride Month, and they're talking about, like, you can't just stamp a rainbow flag on something and then say you are an ally, right? There's like effort and work that is involved in that. Yeah.
So it's 9:00, and do we have any more questions or comments, Daryl?
There are a few comments that have been typed into the chat, but but I don't about B'chol Hashon, which is the multicultural network, etc. Does anybody else have a question or a comment that they'd like to add?
Yes, I just wanted to respond to the last question from Rachel. It is a challenge, and in our experience and Rachel's experience, it is a challenge to bring people in, because just feeling different makes, I think, my kids not feel as connected with Judaism as they might otherwise be, or at least Jewish institutions. Am I right, Rachel? And just feeling a little bit different.
Well, there's also like truth to that, in that my blood, my ancestral roots do not carry the same traumas and gifts that if I were born into a Jewish family, like blood related, like for example, I went on March of the Living, and the kind of like ancestral, visceral pain that I could feel from my peers, I felt a disconnect. And it wasn't lacking empathy. I mean, I can, the feeling is so painful, but I didn't feel the ancestral trauma that my peers did. And that to me, I think is not something that I can change. I think that my relationship with Judaism is largely cultural and in through tradition and, you know, my love for Judaism, which is different from having ancestral experience.
Epigenetic connection.
There you go, epigenetic connection. Yep, my body does not carry that trauma, right? Which I think is a kind of connection within the community that I don't think David or I will ever really experience. And it's not something that is necessarily a bad thing. I still feel connected to the community, but there are elements that I can't necessarily be a part of, right?
That might not be a bad thing. I mean, you know, when I look to the future, I feel like I'm going to go out on a limb here, but I feel like we are going to become a more and more melded and different looking and community than we have been. And so we're not all going to share the same, you know, ancestral trauma, but we're still going to be a community.
Yeah.
Right. Jews are going to look, some of us, we're going to be browner, we're going to be, you know, darker, some of us, we're going to speak different languages, but, and I'm talking, you know, generations, but we're still going to have connections, even if our genetic makeup, our DNA doesn't carry the same messages. And I think that's okay. I think it's actually kind of cool. I mean, personally, that's just my opinion. And I'm hoping that it will make us ever more inclusive over the years. I mean, yeah. So
yeah, totally. I would love to see that. Yeah.
Yeah, does anybody else have any questions? I see a thank you from Maytal. Thank you for sharing with us. She really appreciates your openness and the important work you're doing. And I obviously would second that. We had a bunch of other things we were going to talk about, but I actually think that that is quite enough for one evening. Yeah. I'm trying to think, you know, you have this vibrant practice. You told me the other night that you have 50 people on your wait list to become patients. That's how huge the need is for therapists who are from different cultures and different races, and also who deal specifically with adoption. I imagine they're all three of those areas. And so I hesitate to say this, but you are an amazing speaker. And I could see you, you know, doing all kinds of just public speaking. I heard you do a podcast that was brilliant. You have just a very honest, down to earth, empathetic, expressive way of speaking that just draws people in. So I don't want to make more work for you. And I know you have a child and a husband and parents who want to spend time with you too. But, you know, you're amazing. And I feel like the sky's the limit for you. And I really appreciate that you took time to speak to our group tonight. Really wonderful.
So such kind words. I'm like almost tearing a little bit. Like, thank you so much. That really means a lot to me. And I really thank everybody who joined tonight and who asked really important questions and who, you know, really supported. I could feel the support and I really, really appreciate it. It makes it so much easier for me. I think too that maybe you're seeing a very particular kind of public speaking right now because this feels like family to me, which maybe makes it a little bit easier. So thank you all so much, so much.
Well, we're all here for you always. You know, I always think that when kids stand up and at the Bima for their bar or bat mitzvah, that part of what's happening is that the Becky community is just building a kind of a giant hug, a permanent giant hug around you. So you can always return to us if you need to come back to the well.
I really feel that and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, everyone.
Rachel Spashevkin is going to tell us a little bit about next week's program.
Yes, I'll be happy to. Going in a totally different direction. Next week, I'm going to put a link right now in the chat. When you, and why is it going not to everyone? Okay. This is out of chat. You probably can't copy it, but you can click it, which will prompt you to perhaps tonight take care of ordering your tea kit for next week. Next week is a tea tasting with Caroline Keogh, a Westville neighbor here on Alden, who will be talking about teas and tea blends. All of the teas, the 4 teas in our tasting kit, are all non-caffeine teas so that we can drink them at 8 o'clock and not be thinking of her at 3 in the morning. And so there's one that's actually a tea, but it's decaf, and the others are herbal blends that she creates here in Westville. You maybe have seen her at some of the farmers markets or her assistant. These are organic for the most part and really high-end loose tea, but the kit will have in it tea bags, or you can use a tea strainer at home, whatever. She says, just boil up some hot water, have it ready for 8 o'clock if you want to do the tasting. And in the kit is a sheet to evaluate teas, and she'll teach us how to do that. So you can just log in to listen. Or if you want to pay $13, you can get samples of these 4 teas and all kinds of tea things that she's putting into the bag. And then maybe you'll choose to buy more of it from her or not. But I think it's really interesting to find out about what goes into these various herbal tea blends that we might enjoy in supermarket bags. So if you click, you can get to the Becky kit. That's what it's called. You can pay $3 to have it shipped to you, or you can just pick it up from her front door. And if you order from the website, you can pay by credit card, but you can also through the website say, I want to pay by cash or check, and just work that out with Caroline. And you can just pick it up. She's at the corner of Alden and Cleveland, and she's really terrific. And I thought it was great to support one of our local cottage industries.
Very nice. Great. All right, everyone. Have a good week, and thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Night.
Thanks so much, Rachel.
Bye. Thank you
Thank
so
you, Rachel.
much for
Terrific.
having me. Thank you.